B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, May 23rd, 2019. And it's a day of great relief for yours truly. Because the feared interference by Trump or allies didn't occur. And today at the federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana, John Philip Walker Lindh walked out. Not quite a free man. He's on probation for 3 years with heavy restrictions on his use of the internet. Can't have a passport, can't leave the country. But he is out of American custody for the first time since December of 2001. And it's tragic to recognize that he's been locked up as long as we've had American forces in Afghanistan, in a losing military effort that slogs on with no defined mission and no end in sight. And we only have sketchy information, the family fearing media blowback and right-wing retribution is keeping the lowest possible profile. The only thing we have been led to believe by CNN is that with his freedom, Lindh is planning to live in Virginia, not here in Marin County, California, where his family is and where he grew up. Virginia is where he would be returned by the Federal Bureau of Prisons because that's where his conviction originated. But I don't have any further information about the future plans of this 38-year-old man. And I am relieved to see that the reporting on this is a little less egregious than it has been over the last few days. And I want to commend my talk radio colleague, Pat Thurston of KGO Radio in San Francisco, as I heard her today offering the real story about John Lindh to her listeners, and that is rare. On the other talk channel here, Michael Savage was busy drumming up vilification for Lindh and promoting false narratives that have been in play since 2001. When his arrest was politicized and demagogued by the leaders of the Bush administration. And in the show file for today's podcast, you will find a link to a video interview with Frank Lindh, John's father, that was recorded at a church here in the Marin County area back in 2013. And I want to thank our friend and listener, Tom McAfee, for shooting that video and for supplying the link. As I recall, I was in the audience that day, but I didn't participate in the interview. My interview with Frank Lindh in a podcast, I linked to it just the other day, on Tuesday, if you'd like to dig for it and find it. Well, Trump has drawn in his flanks on the trade war. He's put off a confrontation with Europe over autos, with Mexico and Canada over dairy and other imports. He's dialed back the pressure on Japan, but he's going full force on China. And again, the stock market was reeling today as investors are really jittery about what it all means and how long this is going to last, what the true cost to the American economy will be. In an op-ed at The Guardian today, Jeffrey Frankel, who's a Harvard professor who, from my take, is a pro-free trade guy, he tallies up the damage of these tariffs. The farm sector in particular is feeling a lot of pain, and Trump is expected to offer another bailout to farmers who have lost exports to China in the range of $12 or $13 billion. But what happens to all the other industry sectors that are being hit hard by this? And we live with the delusionary president who believes that attaching tariffs payable to the U.S. Treasury on imports from China will somehow be paid for by China. They're going to be absorbed by U.S. manufacturers to the extent that they're not finished goods, and they're going to be absorbed directly by consumers if they are consumer goods. And nobody is willing to, as Bob Corker, the lame former senator from Tennessee, used to say, poke the bear. You got to poke the bear and let him know that he's full of bear shit. And according to Professor Frankel, the cost for a typical U.S. household is estimated at $800 a year and additional costs of up to $2,200 a year. And just last night, talking to a friend who works in the film industry in Los Angeles, we learned that Chinese producers have been told to cut ties with American production companies. And China's already a very tough market for Hollywood. They only allow a certain number of films to be screened in China on an annual basis. And now the backlot part of it apparently is going to be hammered as China finds ways to get even with Trump for the arbitrary imposition of these trade regulations. And I'll say it again, I'm not opposed to all tariffs. I'm not opposed to fair trade versus free trade. But it has to be done in a rational and coherent manner, and it has to be negotiated. There aren't any negotiations scheduled right now. And so this is going to linger for some period of time. And as we'll get to a little bit later, the rollout of 5G wireless, something that I have very serious concerns about, is at risk because of the trade war that continues these days. So Hollywood is also using its clout in the state of Georgia. Now, over the last 10 years, Hollywood's been producing a lot of films in Georgia. They give tax breaks and things of that nature. I believe it's a right-to-work state, so pesky unions are cut out of the action. But the recent passage of the highly restrictive abortion law has led some producers to pull back from Georgia. Now, this is a sticky issue for the big Hollywood companies because while they have participated in boycotts related to, bathroom laws and LGBTQT, did I get that right? Yeah, I think so. Those issues, abortion, well, it is more divisive. And while 73% of people in a recent poll don't want to see Roe versus Wade overturned, there are many people who are uncomfortable with abortion rights, and so we may not see such a clear signal from Hollywood on this particular front. But we've learned that a TV series based on the best-selling novel by Naomi Alderman called The Power has abandoned plans to produce in Savannah, Georgia. Scouting plans have also been scotched for the Kristen Wiig. I thought she's a Kirsten, not a Kristen. Anyway, she's got a movie called Barb and Star Go to Vista Del Mar, and that will not be shot in Georgia. And today, if you only read one thing, follow the link in my show file to the New York Times for one of the most personal and powerful columns that I've read in a long time, under the byline of Michelle Alexander, who tells a very personal story, prompted by a recent discussion with her own teenage daughter, where she shared with the daughter that while a student at Stanford, Michelle Alexander was raped by a fellow student. And that single sexual incident impregnated her. And while in her lengthy personal story, she says that the rapist did apologize, and that means something to her, that she had to deal with the pregnancy that resulted. And she discloses that she did have an abortion. It was a difficult decision for her to make. And one of the things she points up is the absurdity of these new laws that do not allow for an exception for rape. And in the few states that do have an exception for rape, there is no acknowledgement that most women who are victims of rape never report it. Michelle Alexander said she didn't report her rape. And so if she had needed to insist on an exemption to an extreme abortion law, how would she prove she had been raped? She didn't file a police report. There was no criminal complaint or proceedings that resulted. And the white guys who are busy in their patriarchal way denying abortion rights to women, particularly poor women and women of color, well, they have no idea of what they're doing. And it's reached a new low in Alabama, as if it couldn't be more grotesque to have the most ridiculous and unconstitutional abortion law signed by Governor Kay Ivey last week. Well, last night, the Alabama House of Representatives passed a measure that would sentence doctors to prison if they fail to treat babies who are, quote, born alive after an attempted abortion. Now, this is a scenario that may have occurred once, but the right wing and Trump and his Twitter feed are full of lies, making it seem like on a regular basis a baby is carried to term and either delivered or aborted, and then the mom and the doctor just decide to snuff it out. And I'm sure that these are scary images that live large in the minds of anti-abortion activists. But it's made up, it's concocted. They are outlawing urban legends. And to pile this bill on top of the law that makes it a crime that could send a doctor to prison for longer than if he murdered the mother and her baby, they want to add a 20-year prison sentence on top of that. Now, it's completely incoherent, and it is not related to reality. And that is the state of play in the U.S. today. Leaders of the military are very concerned at moves by the Trump White House, advancing the idea of presidential pardons for men who have been either accused or convicted of war crimes while serving in the U.S. military. And this is popular among the jingoists in this country who believe that Americans can do no wrong when we go into a war zone. We're the good guys, and by default, no matter what we do, it's okay. And they support the U.S. non-participation in the International Criminal Court to prevent justice, international justice, for Americans who make extreme violations of the law. So here are a couple of the thumbnails of people he's considering pardoning. Chief Petty Officer Edward Gallagher, a Navy SEAL, who's awaiting court-martial on charges that he shot unarmed civilians and stabbed a teenage Islamic State fighter in Iraq in 2017. Trump should at least allow the case to be completed and a verdict to be reached before he intervenes. How about the case of Army Major Matthew Goldstein, who is charged with killing an unarmed Afghan in 2010. 3 Marine snipers prosecuted for urinating on the corpse of a dead Afghan fighter in 2011. A former Blackwater mercenary who was convicted of murder for killing unarmed Iraqis in 2007. And I'm glad that people like Martin Dempsey, the former Joint Chiefs of Staff, he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, that's the way to say it. Absent evidence of innocence or injustice, the wholesale pardon of U.S. service members accused of war crimes signals our troops and allies that we don't take the law of armed conflict seriously. And to his credit, Mayor Pete Buttigieg of South Bend, Democratic candidate for president, said, in my view, this is disgusting. If the president blows a hole in that, well, he's referring to the importance of maintaining the credibility of the U.S. military justice system, and if the president blows a hole in that, he's blowing a hole in the military. He is putting troops' lives at risk. And he went on to say, I don't have a problem standing up to someone who was working on season 7 of Celebrity Apprentice when I was packing my bags for Afghanistan. And so I applaud Pete Buttigieg for his strong language on these matters. So we have been around the 24-hour clock now since Nancy Pelosi said that Trump's running a cover-up. And Trump stomped out of the meeting at the White House that was supposed to be about infrastructure. And then he engaged in what I consider to be an adolescent attempt at extortion, saying, well, if you won't stop investigating me, we're not going to work together on infrastructure or anything else. And that kind of juvenile attitude, it reminds me of when I was 5 or 6 and I had a dispute with my mom. I don't even know what it was about. But I looked at her and I shaked my finger. And I said, Mom, I'm running away from home right after you fix me lunch. So this would be really funny if it weren't so tragic for our country. And Pelosi is, I know she's walking this fine line in her mind. She said the White House is just crying out for impeachment. That's why he flipped yesterday. He wants to be impeached so he can be exonerated by the Senate. We got to put exonerated in air quotes. And even if that is Trump's gambit, I believe that the Democrats have run out of wiggle room. His offenses, his defiance, his stonewalling are so extreme that they are sacrificing their self-respect and their credibility as part of a separate co-equal branch of government by putting up with this shit. Now, Pelosi did offer another prayer for the president and the country. And then she added, I wish that his family or his staff or his administration would have an intervention for the good of the country. Well, we don't have the climate for that. Trump has so intimidated those around him that no one dares challenge the naked emperor. And he's got the Republicans, particularly those in the Senate, right where he wants them. And they are afraid to poke the bear. So that's where we stand. I heard Rush Limbaugh this morning in his typical form of projection, denying that Trump had lost his temper or lost control, and saying it's the Democrats who are unhinged. Now, I will say that the Democrats are in a messy situation where they do not have a common position on impeachment. But it's a far stretch from describing them as somehow unhinged or as if they're the ones who are irrational in this particular situation. Trump lost another court case in his effort to block every subpoena that has been issued. This one tells Deutsche Bank and Capital One that they must honor the subpoenas for bank records. And this, of course, leads to conflicts with the testimony provided by Michael Cohen. That is that Trump frequently lied on bank loan applications, used inflated balance sheets and estimates of his net worth. And this is happening faster than I expected, frankly. The courts are moving with unusual speed, and his efforts to use this to just run out the clock and gum things up, I think, will evaporate in relatively short order. A new indictment today, kind of from the Mueller probe. This is the banker in Chicago. He ran the Federal Savings Bank, and he broke all the rules in order to loan Paul Manafort $16 million in 2016, when Manafort was refinancing and reeling in debt. Remember, Manafort was broke when he volunteered to be Trump's campaign chairman at no charge. He was hoping to monetize that, as we say, in other ways. And so this guy, Stephen Kalk, age 54, tried to leverage that $16 million in loans to assurances of an appointment in the Trump administration. He even imagined he could be Secretary of the Treasury. And now he's on the receiving end of a one-count indictment of financial institution bribery. A former Trump appointee, Rex Tillerson, played Secretary of State for about a year, and he's been remarkably quiet. He's an old boy from Texas, and, he's set for life. He doesn't care. But he was invited by the House Foreign Affairs Committee to come on up and chat. And the only thing that's really juicy that he said was that when Trump met with Putin, that was in their first meeting in 2017, and Tillerson was actually in the room. It was the later meeting that Trump went mano a mano with Putin. But he said, we spent a lot of time in the conversation talking about how Putin seized every opportunity to push what he wanted. There was a discrepancy in preparation, and it created an unequal footing. And that's a really polite way of saying that Trump was arrogant, didn't do his homework, and that it visibly affected the outcome of that exchange with Putin. CBS News deserves credit for exposing something that's been hidden for 8 months. A 10-year-old girl from El Salvador died in custody last fall. She becomes the 6th child to die in custody in the past 8 months. And we're not sure why the information about her death was withheld or covered up. And we have a new case of a child who has recently died in custody at the southern border. Every day I pause to thank people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And today we want to mention people like Deborah Hennessy, who just renewed her annual subscription. Or maybe it's a new one. It looks like it could be a new one, Deborah. Thank you. Deborah, I'll be in touch because I owe you a bonus book. And with your new annual subscription, you earn either a copy of 2100, A Dystopian Utopia, the blueprint for human survival on a warming planet, or Dr. Justin A. Frank's profile of Trump called Trump on the Couch. I also want to thank Andrew Harnack, Joe Carson. Danny Altman just took out a new subscription. Thank you, Danny. And also Susan Gavet. They all contribute to this podcast, and you can do it too. All you have to do is visit peterbcollins.com, find the menu button, click on Become a Subscriber. You land on the sign-up page, and it's easy to choose the level of support that's comfortable for you. Well, across the country, states have been passing extreme laws which seek to criminalize First Amendment protests of, say, oil or gas pipelines. And ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Committee, is busy introducing these model bills in legislatures across the country. This started back in 2017 when the governor of Oklahoma signed a law making it a felony to trespass on property designated as critical infrastructure. And with the protests at Standing Rock, we have seen states pick up these prepackaged ALEC bills. Texas just imposed one. And let's see, who else has one? Louisiana, because of citizen protests of the Bayou Bridge oil pipeline. And what we're seeing is that the protesters are fighting back with legal challenges to these laws that, in my view, clearly violate the First Amendment. We'll keep an eye on this as they seek to stifle dissent in this country. I want to thank John Zwiebel, our listener in Hawaii, who shared with me an article about a new bill introduced by Oregon Democrat Peter DeFazio in the House. And this addresses a long-running issue. The U.S. Postal Service is carrying a burden that no other federal agency has. And this burden was imposed on it in 2006 by the Republican Congress. It requires the Postal Service to every year prepay the future health care benefits of its entire workforce. And that's why, on paper, it appears that the Postal Service is insolvent. And DeFazio's bill, which only is opposed by FedEx and UPS, wonder why, was introduced on April 29. It's H.R. 2382. Caitlin Johnstone is continuing to draw attention to the recent report that suggests that dissent was squelched at the Organization for the Prohibition, there we go, of chemical weapons. This relates to the alleged chemical attack in Douma, Syria last year, where Trump and other nations concluded that Syria had used a chemical agent and we bombed them in retaliation. Well, Johnstone points out the irony that as the narrative from last year starts to crumble with this inconvenient dissenting report, which she gets an endorsement of from a man I admire, MIT professor Ted Postal. Well, as that is crumbling, they introduce the allegations of a new chlorine gas attack by the Syrian government this past Sunday. And as usual, you can expect skepticism, well-justified skepticism, from Caitlin Johnstone on this issue. And she says the fact that the OPCW kept the engineering report from receiving not a whisper of attention severely undermines the organization's credibility, not just with regard to Douma, but with regard to everything, including the establishment Syria narrative as a whole and the Skripal case in the UK. I'm glad she brought that up because that's all been swept under the bridge, and people just accept, oh yeah, I'm sure Russia did that because, well, it was on my TV. Last week, Whitney Webb at Mint Press News published an important report, and I'm just getting around to it now. On, in early May, the FBI released a handful of photos, some of which are photocopies of photos, that were taken on September 10th and September 11th in Union City, New Jersey. Pictures of the so-called dancing Israelis. Now, you may know that Trump, who is prone to confusion, has frequently referred to celebrations by Muslims that occurred as they watched the airplanes hit the Twin Towers at the World Trade Center. But the new photos offer more evidence that these Israelis were there as spies working for Mossad. Their cover was that they were employees of Urban Moving Systems, a company that was owned by an Israeli who scrammed out of the United States on September 14th of 2001. Now, there were originally 76 pictures developed by investigators from the camera in the Israelis' possession, but only 14 have been released. And of those, as we mentioned, they are heavily doctored. You cannot see, for example, in the background whether the pictures were taken while Tower 1 or Tower 2 were still standing. One of them, the most inflammatory picture, shows one of the Mossad agents, Sivan Kurzberg, holding a lighted lighter in the foreground with the smoldering wreckage of the Twin Towers in the background. Now, two of the pictures have a timestamp from the camera of September 10th, the day before the attacks. And one of those photos is of the lit lighter being held up. If the timestamp is correct, that suggests that Israel had advanced knowledge that the attacks were coming on September 11th. Now, I applaud Mint Press News and Whitney Webb for continuing to investigate the 9/11 story. The corporate media won't touch it because we all know, right, that the official story was true? Well, not so fast. As you know, I don't accept that so-called official story, and my coverage of the work of the 9/11 Commission is the primary reason for my skepticism. And finally, as I promised earlier, story about 5G. And let's see, 2 Sundays ago, the New York Times ran a story that was promoting 5G as the miracle wireless development that we've all been waiting for. And as critics have pointed out, Carlos Slim, who is a major outside investor in the New York Times, owns a big cell phone company in Mexico. And Verizon has become a partner of the New York Times in the exciting rollout of 5G. So the New York Times cannot be trusted. Their headline said, 5G is safe, but RT, the Russian television network, is sowing discord by promoting challenges to 5G technology. It's bullshit, because there are many Americans like me who question that 5G has never been properly lab tested as to human impacts. The efforts to bust through local regulation to just cram down 5G equipment on our neighborhoods is worth resisting. And there are other reasons as well, including the objections of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. And they've been on the radar with the FCC for months now, saying, look, you're planning to use a certain part of spectrum for 5G that is critical for the forecasting of extreme weather events, because water vapor data is collected on a frequency at 23.8 gigahertz, and the FCC has auctioned off the spectrum right next door at 24 gigahertz for the 5G rollout. So this is not a, Russia propaganda campaign. It's not an effort to sow discord among Americans. It's not disinformation coming from RT. It's a legitimate dispute between agencies of our own government. I'm looking forward to the New York Times coverage of this squabble. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube, and I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.